I tried to study one of the most complex and respected digital artists out there with just one brush, and this is how it went. Today I'll be taking you through the full process of what I've learned from studying Wlop in order to level up my art and get better at creating these insane cinematic and nostalgic scenes. So, a little bit about me. I guess you could say I'm an aspiring concept artist and illustrator. I really like to paint and draw in this semi-realistic way, and I'm on a mission to improve my art by studying some of my all-time favourite artists and games in a series with the goal to learn as much as I can, sharing the process of what I learn along the way and level up my skill set quick. In this video, we're trying to accomplish 3 main things in order to learn as much as I can from Wlop, by first analysing his art, then breaking down and copying one of his works, merging his techniques with my own in order to see how I can integrate parts of his process into my future workflow, and finally, applying everything I've learned into my own attempt based on what I've learned throughout the video, including some tips about how I like to study and some failed attempts along the way, because there were many. And all of this with just one brush. I think it's really easy to get overwhelmed by just how much is out there, like how many different ways there are to create, how many different brushes there are, and how many different ways there are to study. Like, there just seems like there's so much to think about. So if you're anything like me, I think this video will help you a lot, because by giving myself this limitation, I tried to push the idea that, similar to any limited colour palette, having less at your disposal can actually lead to more focus in yourself. So there are a few different ways you can go about studying your favourite artists. I've always thought there's a lot to be learned from how you study. It's really all about intent. And with simplified composition studies like this, I'd never really consider using more than one brush anyway, because I'm solely focused on getting down the forms in front of me in a way that I can understand how the elements are arranged as simply as possible. I've always thought the brush you use doesn't matter all that much, at least not for 80% of the process. So, to test that theory, I wanted to take this simplified approach and apply it to the whole process. So, before we pick the brush for our first study, let's take a look at Wlop. If you've gotten this far into the video or have been on the art side of YouTube for long, then there's a good chance you've heard of Wlop, and if not, then thank you so much for sticking around. Also known as Wang Leng, Wlop is a Chinese digital artist and creator, known for his cinematic paintings and distinctive rendering style, which emphasize the illusion of complexity to create these deceptively detailed characters and backgrounds that blend realism and fantasy with this ethereal vibe. A software engineer by trade, he's become a very well-respected artist, having shared his art online for over 10 years, and more recently has often come to integrate 3D into his process, and is someone who I personally have looked up to for a long time. So, to make an effective study, I want to figure out what makes Wlop feel and look like Wlop. When talking about style, the key thing I'm referring to is those key components that, when looking at an artist's work, let you know that it's theirs. And for Wlop, I've identified a few key elements that I think set him apart and make his art feel distinctly Wlop-like. Namely, his subject matter, dynamic lighting, colour palette, rendering style, and the way he paints skin and metal. So let me quickly elaborate on those. You may have noticed a theme in Wang Leng's work that he tends to include some sort of female character as the focal point, usually quite regal or distinguished looking, and sometimes an animal or item, and a lot of this intricate jewellery or metal of some kind. So for the most part, the subject matter is pretty cohesive and consistent. There are obviously a few outliers to this fact, but generally speaking, when I think of a Wlop painting, along with his dramatic lighting and soft rendering style, these are the elements I think of. So that's what I want to focus on moving forward to our study. When I had the idea of studying Wlop, this was actually the first image that came to mind, mainly because it had all the elements that we mentioned in the previous section, so I was interested in seeing how much I could learn about Wlop and his art from studying it. But as you'll see, I ran into a few roadblocks early with this one. If you're familiar with Wlop's process, you might notice that I'm drawing in a different way to how he does. That's mainly because I wanted to try and see if I could implement his style using my own workflow. So I tried to start by using a different process and just my own comfortable way of working to see if I could get to the same place. But once I got to this stage of the process, I realized there was a disconnect between my understanding of how to get from this stage to this stage. So I tried a few different things. I tried to keep going with this for a little while, and then I even lowered the opacity and started trying to follow his process more directly, but still had no luck. I think, in all honesty, it was a case of lost potential. Like, when it was at this stage, I could see its potential and where it was going, but the further I tried to push it, the less potential I could see. So I think that's why a shift was needed. So since my last study didn't go to plan, I wanted to try again to study Wlop's art, to learn from my values and findings from this first study before I move on to my response. Now that we're starting our main study, I think it's a good time to talk about the brush I'm using. Since a big point of this video was that I don't believe in any specific magic brush for the most part, I opted to use a different brush for each study, sticking to that one brush within each of their own studies, to show that while it can help, you don't necessarily need any specific brush to achieve a particular result. However, having said that, that's not to say I don't understand having a favourite brush. I very much do. Look, it's gorgeous. And I used this during the last study, but honestly, you wouldn't really be able to tell, and I think that's kind of my point. And based on the challenge of Wlop's painting style, I found myself picking what I'd consider to be similar types of brushes for each study, all free to access, and I'd say all flat brush adjacent. So Procreate's default brush and a brush from Evident Brush Pack, free brush pack, which I will link in the description. So to start off the study, I started by roughly blocking in the shapes. Both Wlop and I paint from grayscale to colour, so this was actually in my favour. And I tried to be a lot more intentional with my study, so I came up with a little, very basic plan of action where I watched his process all the way through multiple times and decided that I could get to this stage using my own method. So I broke it down into steps, trying to do one step at a time. So this time, even though I'm still following my own process, I actually have a plan. When I'm painting, I don't really have too much rhyme or reason. I kind of just like to do a bit everywhere. So I found setting these intermediary milestones really helpful because it just gave me a mini goal to work towards from his process. Around this point in the process is when I first started to introduce colour, by just making a selection around my drawing and toggling the layer modes until I had something I liked. I think of the way I like to draw in a very similar way to traditional reduction drawings or paintings, like if you're drawing with chalk on black paper or erasing to get a result. I like to have this kind of intentional scribbling effect because I think I can get to where I want to be much easier. Like, I find seeing relationships between shapes so much easier than relationships between lines, and just carve out the forms that way. And throughout this whole process, I'm utilizing everything at my disposal. The lasso tool a lot, which you will see right from the beginning, even just to block out the background shape, and also to get finer details, because that is something I did struggle with throughout this whole painting, because I can't get as detailed as I would like with the brush. But it could also be my canvas size, since I do work generally like not that big. I'm not sure if this stuck out to anyone, but I didn't really talk about the brush I was using during my first failed attempt. Even though it is my favourite brush to use in general, it ended up pretty much being a non-factor in my study, and it was very secondary to my understanding, mainly because I hadn't gotten far enough into the process for it to be an issue yet. Like I said, I don't think I was anywhere near that 80% yet. But during these later studies, I definitely felt the impact of the limitation a lot more, which I'll get into as we go. But the three main areas I fell in were detailing, efficiency, and variation. But since I still allowed myself the rest of the tools at my disposal, like lasso tool, liquify, smudge tool, and layer modes, I think the process went a lot smoothly than it would have otherwise. I'm not gonna lie, I think lasso tool single-handedly saved me during this whole experiment. I don't know, I think it kind of shows that it's not necessarily about the brush you're using, but more about the process as a whole. So a moment ago, you might have just noticed the colours changing a lot, and basically all I did to achieve that was make a copy of my current canvas and then use gradient map and blend modes to try and adjust it to get it more accurate, which is honestly probably the biggest life art hack I could give. And I'm glad because I'd made her look ill. This study, like any other, I had a lot of trial and error to figure out what I was doing, and I think it's pretty empowering, especially in the colours and how roundabout my process was, but I do improve them as we go, so don't worry. Throughout the study, I think there were a few things that helped me get closer to the goal. First of all, adding in the lighting and jewelry helped so much. I think the jewelry kind of helps transform it a little bit, as well as getting the background to more closely align. I found that the relationship between the characters in the background actually had a big impact on the image as a whole, so that is something I noticed. Personally, I can still see the flaws and the gap between where I was trying to get, but I decided that I should stop trying to be a perfectionist because I think I learned enough to comfortably move on to the response, and I'm honestly happy with it. For most of the process, up to the very last stage, I was just eyeballing colours and tones, shapes as best I could. It was only in the last 5% maybe that I put the reference directly next to it, which helped so much. I wish I did it before, to try and see how far I could push it. So then I started colour picking, but before that, that's why the colours are changing so dramatically all the time, because I'm trying to figure out the colour relationships and my eyes are struggling. In any case, this is the finished result. Although I don't think I'm anywhere near Wlop's level yet, I think I did okay for a study. I think mine definitely lacks some of the depth and crispness that Wlop's has, but that is something that I noted moving on to my responses. Okay, so we finally made it to the most fun part. So for my response, my first course of action was to pick a reference, since the subject matter is so important. So to do this, I, as always, scrolled through Pinterest for a bit and stumbled across quite a few good images that I honestly was quite excited to study, and I settled on a few options. In very me fashion, I also started another one, so I saw this image and I thought that it could be really cool, but as I got further into it, there was nothing wrong with it per se. I just felt that it could be more Wlop-like. So, and since I had so many options anyway, I decided to just pivot and try this one. I think I just wanted to do this one. All of my options were so cool and had such good lighting, and honestly, to me, good lighting just makes anything exciting to study. Like, it's my favorite thing. So for process, I'm taking a very similar approach to when I studied Wlop, just roughing in shapes and building up light on top of dark until I reveal the forms I want. Honestly, I had a lot of fun with this one and it came much more smoothly to me, so I was glad for that. After I've locked in the main forms, I then move on to using a multiply layer and just creating a little sense of form so it's easier to build on top of, as well as sketching in some of the accessories and highlights. Here I'm just working on the features of the face, mainly trying to capture the soft expression and stick to the likeness as much as I can, which is a step that continues throughout the whole process, just adjusting and refining as I go. Now it's time for a colour again, so this time instead of selecting the whole canvas and colorizing it that way, I just went for the skin and did all of the parts individually, selecting each area so I can create masks later on and selections later on. At this stage, I wasn't sure how closely I wanted to stick to the reference, so here you'll see me blocking in this red colour, but I end up changing it later on, mainly because as a theme within Wongling's work. I do see a lot of these like neutral, like whites and blacks in the same image, so I wanted to try and do that. Even after adding colour, I'm still considering the forms, and at this point I wasn't sure how I felt about the mount, so I experimented with painting over it. And I think that's something I recommend. Like, if you're unsure about something or you think something could look better but it's a little late into the process, I think still go for it. At least for me, I know I can always go back to a previous version, but testing it out will never hurt. Here again with colour, I was just playing with the hue, saturation, brightness sliders as well as the gradient maps to help me visualise what I want. Okay, so here I took a little detour. Sometimes I like to do this when I reopen a project or re-look at what I'm working on. I just go to an earlier version and just mess around, and I figured if I completely changed the color, it would help me see like the forms better, kind of like turning your canvas upside down or flipping your canvas. Just like seeing slightly differently can help you understand better. So I tried it and it was pretty fun. I didn't end up continuing with this version, but I did use it later as an overlay to like adjust colors, so it wasn't useless. Making note of a turning point in my illustration, because basically I was noticing that my response wasn't looking enough like Wlop, like it didn't feel enough like Wlop. So at a certain point I just went back to ArtStation and scrolled through every single one of his like paintings on there and stopped relying as much on my reference and more on his art to solve the problems, and I think it's helping. I think considering Wlop's style really helped inform some of my decisions that I made during this painting, but this shift was genuinely so helpful to me because before I think I had some assumptions that I'd made, but having it directly in front of me, like having my reference and like what I was striving for directly in front of me, made me realize quite a few things. Like one thing, I was working like desaturated and dark, and I realized that Wlop actually uses much more vibrant colors than I originally assumed. And so after I brightened up my image and tried to get the background down a bit more, I think it started to look a lot more successful. So as we start nearing the end of the process, I think it's a good time to discuss a few of my thoughts. I had a lot of fun studying and responding to Wlop's art. Something I was concerned about was that I wasn't implementing enough of his techniques since I was working in a different way, but I think it turned out okay regardless. It actually turned out that studying Wlop himself was the biggest challenge throughout all of this. Regardless of the one brush, his style being so intricate and detailed was definitely the hardest challenge to wrap my head around, especially adding details and finish, making things crisp and polished is where I fell short a bit. But this was actually a very helpful exercise for me, and I'd recommend it for anyone who wants to try. But all in all, I'd say painting with one brush wasn't all that bad. I definitely would not switch to it as a default workflow. Like, it's quite inconvenient, if anything, knowing that you could achieve things quicker if I use more tools is definitely something I take note of. And also, getting the final details is sometimes hard depending on the brush I picked, because I couldn't really get in as much, but it did force me to rely on my other tools more. In that sense, it was like a helpful exercise, and it forced me to just focus on the task at hand and not get bogged down what brush I was using or anything like that. So I'd recommend it as an exercise. So with the addition of these final details and final touches, I think it's about time to call it done. But let me know what you think. I'm very curious. Do you think I should have taken it further and stuck more closely to Wlop's style? Or do you think I did a good job? And on the same vein, if you have any artists that you think I should study, let me know. I do have some in mind, so definitely keep an eye out for them. And with that brings us to the end of my first ever video. If you liked this one, please consider sticking around. If you're also interested in studying Wlop for yourself, I definitely recommend checking him out. He has his own channel here on YouTube, which I'll link below, and all his socials as well, where he has a lot of members only courses, and he also has a Patreon. So if you're interested, definitely check them out. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.